The wind was a living thing out here in Blackthorn Hollow, a beast with claws of ice, and a voice that scraped against the timber of the old trading post like a dying animal. It was late winter 1886, and the ground was a patchwork of crusted snow and mud frozen so hard it cracked under my boots like brittle glass. My coat patched at the shoulders flapped around my legs, the sound swallowed by the gale. I dismounted from my mule, a worn-out creature breathing in short frosted bursts. Her hooves were caked with rime, and she shuddered with a weariness that matched my own. My name is Caleb Thorne. I'd not come here for company, not for warmth. I'd come for a horse, any horse strong enough to pull what was left of my family's world out of ruin. For a year I had been burying not just my brother, but a way of life. Every storm, every missed harvest, every fence rail that fell was another nail in the coffin of the Thorne family ranch. This trip to the trading post was my last desperate gamble. If I couldn't find a beast of burden here, I'd have to sell the land and move on a final defeat that tasted worse than dust. Inside, the fire was low, but the air was thick with the sharp smells of whiskey lye soap and old hides. A grizzled man I knew only as Silas, the post's owner, sat behind a counter whittling a stick. He didn't look up, just grunted a greeting. I made my trade a sack of grain for a strip of salt pork and followed him to the back pens. Not much left, Silas grunted, his cold, cracked hands fumbling with a latch. Had better stock before the storm, but folks been desperate. Got a couple half-broke geldings and a swayback sorrel. Not much for pullin'. I nodded, stepping past the gate. My eyes scanned the pens with the slow caution of a man who had seen things die from both bullets and starvation. I saw the horses too thin, too lame, too wild. My gaze passed over them all, and a familiar emptiness settled in my chest. I turned to leave, the last bit of hope shriveling inside me. That's when I saw her. She wasn't in the first pen, not where a horse should be. She was in a stall meant for livestock, tethered by a rusted iron chain looped loosely around her ankle. Its end was knotted to a rotting fence post, a human being. Her coat was no better than a feed sack, a tattered dress hanging above her knees, her legs bare and blue with cold. Her hair hung in snarled ropes over her face, and her hands were raw from the wind. When she looked up, I froze. Her eyes were the color of river stones, clear gray and wide, with something in them that was not fear but the memory of it. Her lips trembled, then parted. "Please," she said, her voice a whisper that barely reached me over the wind, "take me instead. I can work. I can cook. I won't run." I said nothing. For a long moment I simply stared, the world shrinking to the space between us. All that existed was her voice, the rusted chain, and a look in her eyes that said she had begged someone else before, and they had not listened. "The trade for a life," Silas grunted from behind me. "She ain't for sale. Belongs to a fella down from the hollow. Traded her for 2 bottles and a half pouch of opium root. Some kind of niece, I think." A sickness curdled in my gut. My hands balled into fists, the cold forgotten. "What's his name?" I asked, my voice a low rumble. Silas shrugged. "Didn't ask, didn't care. Man said he'd be back in 3 days. That was 6 ago. I took a step forward, my boots crunching on the frozen mud. The girl didn't flinch. She stood as if she had been hit too many times to fear it again. I bent down, examined the rusted chain. It wasn't even locked, just wrapped 3 times. A child could have broken it with a rock. But she stayed. "You could have run," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded faintly. "I know. Why didn't you?" Her throat worked as she swallowed hard. Nowhere to go. I stood and turned back to Silas, my resolve as hard as the ground under our feet. I had come for a horse, but I had found something that needed saving more. My own needs, my family's legacy. It all suddenly seemed small and selfish. "How much for the swayback in her?" I asked. Silas spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the snow. "What the hell would you want her for?" His eyes narrowed. $20 for the nag, and hell, I don't know. Throw in your rifle, I guess." I reached behind my shoulder and unbuckled the Winchester strapped to my back. It was my father's, my brother's, now mine, a symbol of protection and a tie to my past. I laid it across the fence without a word. Silas grunted, pulled out a dirty knife, and cut the rope holding the swayback. He then walked over and cut the knot on the girl's chain. "She's yours," he said, his voice flat with a mix of disdain and pity. "God help you." The girl didn't move at first. Then slowly I extended my gloved hand. She stared at it, at the space between my calloused palm and her own trembling fingers, and something seemed to crack in her chest. "My name's Willow," she whispered, her voice still thin but a little stronger. I nodded. "Caleb." She took my hand. It was not the hand of a savior. It was the hand of a man who had buried his brother, dug graves in frozen ground, and built fences alone until his fingers bled. But it was steady. And for the first time in a long time, Willow stepped forward instead of shrinking back. The journey into silence, I didn't look back as we walked toward the sled. I couldn't. I knew in my soul that if I had left her in that stall, I would not have been able to look at myself again. The ride back was long and brutal, the wind whipping around us in quiet gusts that settled snow in her dark hair. Willow sat rigid on the sled, her hands buried deep beneath the rags of her coat, clutching the fabric across her chest like a shield. She didn't flinch. She had learned how to sit still, how to disappear. I drove in silence, my shoulders hunched against the wind, my eyes fixed on the trail winding through the black woods. I did not speak. I did not glance back. For that she seemed strangely grateful. Every time the sled hit a bump and her body shifted closer to mine, her muscles would seize. She didn't dare meet my eyes. I could feel her fear, a palpable thing in the air between us. She knew what men did when they thought no one would stop them. Her stepfather, she had called him. The man who owned her, who had traded her away. I didn't have to know the details to feel the weight of it. By the time we reached the ranch, dusk had painted the mountains in bruised blues and ash grays. The house was small but solid, weathered pine siding and a chimney curling smoke into the slate sky. A stable stood to the side, and a single horse, my brother's old mare, whinnied softly at our approach. I jumped down first, tying the mule to the post. Then I turned and held out a hand to Willow. She stared at it, her eyes wide, and did not move. I didn't force her. Instead, I walked to the door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The warmth from the dying fire crackled faintly. I waited. Slowly, cautiously, she followed, gripping her sleeves tight as if ready to pull them over her hands. A bed and a promise inside the cabin was modest but clean. A wooden table, a small stove shelves lined with jars of beans and flour. A single cot by the wall where I slept, and beside it, unexpectedly, I had made another bed smaller with a freshly folded quilt at the end. It was the bed my brother Ethan used to sleep in. I spoke, my voice rough but low. "That one's yours." She blinked, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. I moved past her, lifted the lid off the kettle, and stirred whatever was simmering inside. She stood still in the doorway, unsure whether to step forward or run. "You hungry?" I asked. She nodded, a faint, almost imperceptible movement. I ladled soup into a dented tin bowl and set it on the table. I did the same for myself. No words, no permission asked. She sat down cautiously, her back impossibly straight, her spoon clutched tight like a weapon. Her eyes flicked to me, then away. What did he want? When would it begin? But I just sat, ate in silence, my eyes on the flames, not her. I could feel her watching me, waiting. I knew what she was waiting for. She didn't trust it. Couldn't. The moment the soup was gone, she pulled her coat tighter, wrapping herself like a ghost. Her body was still braced for hands that never came. I stood and placed another log on the fire, the sparks flying up the chimney with a soft whoosh. Then I turned to her, and my voice was quiet, but it held the weight of every promise I intended to keep. "No one touches what ain't theirs," I said. "And you ain't anyone's." Her breath caught. She stared at me, a flicker of something new, not fear, but pure raw bewilderment. I didn't smile, didn't move toward her. I just walked to my cot and lay down facing the wall. I heard her sit on the edge of the smaller bed, the cot springs groaning under her small weight. She sat for a long time, her hands frozen around the rim of her empty bowl. Her heart beat too fast. Her stomach churned with something unfamiliar. Not fear, not quite. I heard her get up, walk to the corner where the other bed waited, and sit on the edge. Her body shook, not from cold, but from memory. From years of being looked at like something to be bought, owned, and broken. I heard the quiet tears. She buried her face in the quilt, too afraid to sob aloud, but unable to stop the wet trembling. I felt a crushing weight on my own chest, an echo of a pain I had seen before. A pain I could do nothing but give space to. I did not move. I did not watch her. I simply let her be. And for the first time, she began to believe maybe she was not something ruined. Maybe she was someone still worth protecting. The unspoken language of winter. The snow never stopped falling completely. Some mornings it came soft as breath. Other days it howled in sheets across the ridge. But it was always there, a white, endless presence that coated the roof, the fields, the fence rails. And somehow, between the cold and the silence, Willow began to live again. There was no schedule, no orders, no spoken promises. Just days strung together by work and warmth, and moments that stitched themselves into something like peace. I showed her how to stack kindling, how to coax a flame from damp tinder without smothering it. She learned how to strain broth, how to mend the leather tack when the stirrups cracked, how to shovel manure without gagging. She learned to carry water without spilling, to chop carrots even when her hands were shaking, and how to sweep the floor until the corners gleamed. And I never asked about where she came from. never asked what the chain around her ankle had meant. In return, she did not ask about the scar across my collarbone, or why my eyes lingered on the mountain so long after the sun dipped behind them. We shared space like old wolves, cautious, distant, and somehow inseparable. If she fell asleep near the fire, I would pull a blanket over her without waking her. If I came in late from checking traps, she would set aside a portion of stew still warm. We took turns stoking the fire at midnight, refilling the water basin, locking the doors tight against wind and worse. It was a fragile life, but it was ours. One evening, I woke to the sound of Willow outside. It was late, near midnight, and the moon hung low behind clouds. Through the frosted window, I saw her kneeling in the snow near a thicket of pine trees. She held something in her hands, old, faded, and familiar. I crept to the door without making a sound. It was Ethan's hat, strayed at the brim, caved in at the crown. A boy's hat. I had found it tangled in the brush a few days earlier, frozen solid, and had planned to bury it when the ground thawed. I watched her, a silent shadow. She dug a shallow grave with her bare hands, slow and methodical, and placed the hat inside. Then she sat back on her heels, her shoulders rising and falling once then again. She couldn't see my face, but her body spoke for her, a grief that was not her own but shared. She stayed there a long time, just breathing. Then she stood and walked back toward the cabin. I stepped away from the door before she could see me. The next morning she said nothing. Just before breakfast, she stepped outside with a mug of water and walked barefoot across the snow. The cold must have bitten at her skin, but she did not seem to care. She found the small mound where the snow had been disturbed and laid a single branch of dry mountain pine upon it, green, sparse, and fragrant. That night I found it. I stood by the mound for nearly 15 minutes. I didn't bend down, didn't touch the pine. I only looked. When I came inside, I did not speak. But the next morning I handed her a new pair of socks. Wool, thick, patched, not bought but made. I had spent the last 2 nights working on them with my brother's old needles and a ball of yarn I'd been saving. Willow understood what they meant. She did not need to explain the pine branch, and I did not need to thank her for it. That was how we lived. In gestures and silences that said more than confessions, in the firewood split evenly, in the way I always left a second spoon by the pot, in how she swept not only the floor but the boots by the door. And slowly, without permission, the cabin became something more than shelter. It became ours. The storm and the anchor. A storm came down from the hills like a curse, sweeping across the valley with a howl that sounded almost human. Wind tore through the trees, bending pines until they cracked like bones. Snow swallowed everything, sky, fences, even the barn walls, until the world turned to a shifting blur of white blindness. I had seen war, seen the dead of winter chew through men with steadier hands than rifles ever could. But even I cursed under my breath as I dragged a tarp over the woodpile, struggling against gusts that nearly knocked me off my feet. The horses were spooked, kicking at their stalls, eyes wide with wild panic. I moved from gate to gate, securing each latch with frostbitten fingers. Then came the cry. It was not loud, not over the wind, but it carried high and sharp, desperate. A broken hinge, a loose plank. The skittish bay we had just begun to train had bolted, snow kicked up behind her fleeing body like steam off a cannon shot. Before I could even shout, I saw Willow, barefoot, her coat flapping open, her hair a tangle of dark fire in the wind. "Willow," I roared, but the storm took my voice, tore it to pieces before it could reach her. She ran with a kind of reckless courage that made my chest tighten with something more than fear. I ran after her, my legs burning in the deep snow. I found her near the ravine's edge where the snowbank dipped dangerously. The horse's leg was caught in the twisted roots of a frozen shrub, its nostrils flaring with terror. Willow had dropped to her knees in the snow, whispering soft nonsense to calm the animal, pressing her body against its flank as if to shield it from the storm. Her hands bled where the branches scratched her. Her breath came in sobs, but she did not stop until the hoof was free and the horse could limp forward. By the time I reached them, both girl and animal were coated in ice. She collapsed before they reached the barn. I caught her mid-fall, lifting her into my arms with a shout that echoed uselessly into the wind. Inside the cabin, I moved with a ferocity that came from something deeper than panic. I stripped the soaked dress from her shivering body, wrapping her in every quilt and blanket I owned. I built the fire high until it roared the logs, spitting and crackling with fury. Herbs were boiled, mint willow bark, and the last of my fever root stash. I mashed the roots with my bare hands, not caring when they stained my palms brown. Warm cloths were pressed to her skin. Broth was spooned between chattering lips. Willow burned with fever for 2 days. I did not leave her side. When her lips cracked, I touched them with honey on a ragged fingertip. When her body curled against invisible pain, I sat beside her, holding her hand, not tightly but firmly like an anchor. I did not speak to God. I no longer believed in that. But I watched her chest rise and fall, counting each breath like a man who had seen too many stolen. And then at the quiet edge of the third dawn, Willow opened her eyes. The fire had died low. Snow whispered against the window panes. I sat slumped in the chair beside her bed, head bowed, eyes, closed hands still wrapped gently around hers. She stared at that hand, large, scarred, and still. He had not let go. Her voice, when it came, was dry as paper. "Why did you really bring me here?" I stirred, my eyes opening slowly, sleep still clinging to the edges. I looked at her, not surprised, not hesitant, just present. "Because," I said, my voice rough but quiet, "something told me you weren't done being alive yet." No grand speech, no poetic reason. Just that. She blinked and tears pulled at the corners of her eyes and slipped down her cheeks into the wool pillow. They were not loud tears. Not shaking ones, but deep, silent. The kind that come when someone finally says what your heart never dared believe. He thought she was still worth saving, still worth living for. I got up, stoked the fire, and placed another pot of herbs to boil. No more words, no request for thanks, just care. Willow turned her face to the side, listening to the sounds of the fire and the wind which was finally passing. Something in her chest, something long buried, had begun to thaw, the finality of a gunshot. The sky was slate gray when the hoofbeats came, sloppy, uneven, drunk with mud. I was in the barn mending a harness. Willow was inside folding clean linens near the hearth. When I heard it, that sound, that rhythm, I froze. My hands stopped their work, the leather strap slipping from my grip. I moved to the window, heart already racing, and looked out. He was there. Jedediah Stone. Drunk, filthy, slouched in the saddle like a sack of meat in rage. His coat was torn, his face half covered in frost and madness. The bottle in his hand sloshed as he rode straight up to the fence, yelling loud enough to wake the dead. "You got someone of mine, ranch boy," he bellowed. "Send her out. That little whore don't get to hide behind your cow fences and your lies." I heard Willow's choked gasp from inside the cabin. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." She ran to the door but could not speak. Her throat was locked, her body remembering too much. Outside, Jedediah dismounted clumsily and stumbled toward the cabin. "You hear me," he screamed. "You stole what ain't yours. She's mine, I fed her, clothed her. She owes me." The front door swung open before he reached the steps. I stood there, my rifle in my hand, calm as stone. "You're not welcome here," I said, my voice. A low, steady command. Jedediah squinted at me, his eyes bleary with drink. "That her hiding in there like she's got worth. You think you're her savior, huh?" He took a step forward, his foul breath visible in the cold air. I raised the rifle. Slow, steady, pointed directly at Jedediah Stone's forehead. "You touch her, you bleed," I said the words, coming from a place of cold, quiet fury I hadn't known I possessed. "You speak her name, you die." Jedediah blinked, then laughed, a jagged, broken sound. "She's mine," he shouted, pulling a knife from his coat. The shot rang out so fast it seemed to split the wind. It was not meant to kill him, only to stop him. Jedediah screamed, dropped to the snow, clutching his leg. I walked forward, grabbed him by the collar, and dragged him through the snow like a sack of rot. The older man swung once wildly with his free hand, but I dodged it and knocked him out with the butt of the rifle. One clean blow, efficient, final. The silence after was thick and wide. Willow stepped out of the cabin, barefoot in the cold. She watched as I tied the man's hands, slung him over his horse like a broken sack, then walked to the fence post by the gate. There, with a piece of charcoal and an old board I'd been saving, I wrote in jagged, heavy strokes, "No one owns Anion." I nailed it to the gate. Then I turned to Willow. Our eyes met, and for the first time she did not flinch. I did not reach for her. I just nodded. "I'll ride him to town," I said quietly. "He won't be back." Willow stood straighter. Something in her chest shifted. She was not hiding anymore. She was watching her past be carried away by the same road that had once brought her pain, and beside her stood a man who made sure it never would again. In the language of ash and lead, the night was long and windless. No snow fell. No coyotes howled. The cabin stood like a lone ember in a sea of black woods, warmed only by the soft crackle of fire and the hush of two people who sat too close to call it distance, too quiet to call it peace. Willow curled her legs beneath her on the old quilt-draped bench, a mug of broth resting in her hands. The warmth seeped into her fingers, but her thoughts stayed cold, old echoes still drifting like frost on the edges of memory. The firelight flickered across her face, catching in her lashes, casting shadows beneath her eyes. Eyes no longer hollow, but still cautious. I sat across from her, elbows on my knees, my jaw tight. I stared into the flames like a man trying to read the language of smoke, searching for something I had lost long ago. The lines in my brow deepened with every pop of the cedar log. It was Willow who spoke first, her voice so soft it could have been mistaken for the fire settling. Do you want to know what I thought? That first night, I didn't move, but I looked at her. My silence said yes. I thought about running, she said. Even barefoot, even through the snow just away. She gave a small dry laugh, bitter at the edges, hollow in the middle. Because I didn't believe there were men who gave without asking. Not anymore. Maybe not ever. I swallowed hard, but still said nothing. She looked down at her mug, then out past the window where the dark pressed up against the glass. I even tried once. Before you, there was a bridge near the place I was kept. It wasn't high just enough. Her voice caught there, but she didn't stop. I stood there for hours, cold shaking, but I didn't jump. She stared into the steam rising from her cup, her fingers clenched white around the ceramic. Do you know why? I waited still as stone, because I thought even death might not want me, might spit me out. I was already too used up, too filthy. What was the point of dying if I wasn't even worth that? Her words floated out and settled between us like ash. She wasn't crying. Not really. Her eyes were wet, but it was like the tears belonged to someone else. Someone younger. Someone who hadn't learned how to build walls out of silence. My hand tightened around the armrest. Then slowly, like it hurt to do it, I reached into the collar of my shirt and pulled out a thin chain. At the end hung a bullet, flat and dark, its groove scarred with years. This one came right here, I said, tapping just beneath my ribs. Vicksburg Union lines. My brother Ethan shoved me behind a barrel, took the second bullet, died right there in the mud. Willow didn't speak. She didn't move. She only listened. I stayed, I said. Part of me didn't want to. I thought, maybe I was supposed to go with him. We always said we'd ride home together or not at all. My voice had gone hoarse by then, but I kept my eyes on the fire as if afraid they'd betray more than I could afford to give. The silence between us grew dense. Then Willow's voice, fragile but firm. But you didn't. No, I said, I didn't. I opened my hand. She looked at it for a long moment, calloused, steady, patient. Then, like it was the most terrifying thing she had ever done, she reached out and set her hand in mine. Our fingers didn't tangle. They simply rested together, skin against skin, warm and quiet. It was the first time we had touched without fear. My thumb brushed the back of her hand and her breath hit sharp and unfamiliar. You're not broken, I said, my voice rough as gravel but steady. And even if you were, I'd still want you here. She blinked fast, not because of tears, but because her body didn't know what to do with this kind of kindness. He was not trying to fix her. He was staying. He saw the cracks and he stayed. Her shoulders shifted, tilting ever so slightly toward me. Not for warmth, not for safety, but because she wanted to. She wanted to be held not like a possession or a project or a prize, but like someone understood. I moved slowly, my arm coming around her shoulders, drawing her close in a way that asked, nothing promised, only presence. She rested her head beneath my chin, and we sat that way for a long time. The fire kept burning low and steady. We were not healed, but we were here together, and for now that was everything. The promise of spring. The snow melted in threads, not rivers. First the drips from the eaves, then the softening of the earth beneath my boots. By the end of March, patches of green pushed up between stones, stubborn and small, but unmistakably alive. Willow woke one morning to the sound of birds. Real birds, not crows or hawks, but the trill of a meadowlark. It made her sit up in bed, her heart oddly full, as if the song had been meant just for her. By midday she was outside helping me hammer the frame for a new corral. The old one had collapsed under the weight of the storm like so many things that winter. Now in the crisp, thawed light we built again. Willow wore one of my shirts tied at the waist. Her hair longer, now swayed in the wind, no longer matted or hidden beneath rags. Dirt smudged her cheek and she did not wipe it away. I watched her work, not to supervise, not out of suspicion, but with a quiet respect that only comes from having seen someone rise from near ruin and choose again and again to stay upright. She learned to ride that week. It was my idea. Every person should know how to move through this land on their own terms, I said, and she had nodded, though fear still curled in her gut. But when she mounted the brown mare, her knees trembling, I stood beside her with one hand on the saddle horn. My eyes calm, my voice steady. You do not have to run anymore, I said, my voice low and earnest. But if you ever want to, I want you to know how to run your way. I rode 10 feet that day, then 20. By the end of the week, she circled the pasture and laughed for the first time since she had come to the ranch. I left for town a few days later. Supplies, I said. Willow offered to go, but I shook my head. Let me bring you something back, I said. Something that ain't food or firewood. I returned the next afternoon, dust on my coat and something wrapped in flannel tucked inside my pocket. I did not hand it to her right away. I waited until sunset when we stood on the ridge behind the cabin overlooking the pasture now glowing gold with new grass. Then I pulled out the bundle and placed it gently in her hands. She unfolded the cloth slowly. Inside was a silver hair comb, simple, elegant, etched with tiny wildflowers along the edge. Worn in places but still gleaming. Willow stared. She had never owned anything pretty. Never owned much of anything that had not come from someone else's want or filth. I saw it in the general store, I said, my voice rougher than usual. It ain't new, but it's free. It's yours. No one ever paid for it with you. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. The silver felt cool against her skin. She turned away, slightly ran the comb through her hair and tucked a lock behind her ear. Then she looked at me. I've never belonged to anything good, she whispered. Until now. I did not answer. I only looked at her with that same stillness, the kind that steadied storms. Together we stood as the sun dropped behind the mountains, casting long shadows and golden light across the land. We did not speak again that evening. We did not need to. A family born of choice. The spring wind came softer, now less bite, more whisper. Wildflowers crept across the pasture like someone had spilled color across the earth on purpose. The fence posts had all been replaced. The cabin roof no longer leaked, and inside laughter sometimes echoed between the walls. One afternoon, while Willow was trading eggs for flour at the edge of the road, a traveling peddler squinted at her. "Ain't you the girl from last winter?" he asked, his voice loud and thoughtless. "The one who was chained up behind the stock pen, sold for a bottle," they said. Willow flinched. Not out of shame, but out of memory, that old cold sting. I was tying down sacks of grain nearby. I looked up slow and calm and spoke before she could. "She was I," said my voice steady as stone. "Now she's my wife." The man blinked, muttered something, and walked off. Willow stared at me. I didn't look at her, just kept tying the rope firm and sure, like I had simply stated a fact of the world. That night, under the tall cypress near the hill behind the barn, we were married. No preacher, no witnesses, just Willow in a dress she had sewn from flour sacks. And me in my cleanest shirt, my hair combed back for once. We stood beneath branches laced with new green leaves, the sky above us streaked with lavender and gold. Willow took my hand first. "I don't have vows," she whispered. "Me neither," I said. "Just hands." We joined them. The horses watched from the fence line. The wind carried the scent of blooming sage and cedar. We kissed gentle, shy, like it was still new, still delicate, but it was not afraid. Afterward, back at the cabin, Willow slipped inside and placed something on the hearth. A letter folded clean, pressed flat, written in the quiet hours of her last night as a girl alone. I saw it, but did not touch it. She nodded toward it. "Read it when you want," she said. Or never. Later, while she was brushing her hair, I sat down and opened it. The ink was uneven, a little smudged at the corners, but the words were clear. "You didn't save me. You didn't rescue me. You stood still. You built something quiet and kind and strong and let it stay open until I stepped into it. You gave me space until I found myself worth saving. And now I want to build something with you. Not because I owe you, but because I choose you." I read it twice. Then I folded the letter again and placed it behind the old stone on the mantel. That night I built a fire, not because it was cold, but because the light made the room feel more like home. And when Willow sat beside me, her head on my shoulder, her hand finding mine, I knew something simple and eternal. This cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a home tangible. We were no longer two people trying to survive. We were a family born not from rescue, but from choosing to stay. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.